Welcome to A Philosophy of Action. Last time we talked about immigration and birth rates. Those topics fall under having descendants, at least the having descendants part of our philosophy. Today we move into the second point, survival. By survival I mean not just individual survival, but the survival of the government, the state, the nation, and of course the individuals within it. How do we judge this? Through both foreign and domestic policy, with a focus on security. We'll talk in two parts. First, foreign policy, diplomacy, and the military, and then later domestic policy, with things like police, law, and justice. Foreign policy has two big sides, diplomacy and military. Diplomacy is the peaceful side. Leaders and governments discuss how to prevent conflict, pursue goals together, and build collaboration between nations. The military is the forceful side, using violence to enforce your will, or to prevent another from enforcing theirs on you. Inevitably, if you win even a defensive war, you end up imposing your policy goals on the other side. Diplomacy as a reciprocal deal-making tool. Diplomacy is actually very simple when you boil it down, at least in the philosophy of action. It's about making credible deals, and the key question is always, does this deal serve the hierarchy of values in a philosophy of action? Does it help us have descendants survive and thrive? If it doesn't, it's a bad deal. If it does, it's a good deal. And sometimes even short-term benefits are worth it, as long as the full accounting comes out positive. How do you make such deals? Generally by being direct and reciprocal. In my personal life, I've found that simply stating what you want works. Why? Because you always hold a veto anyway. The point isn't to stop the other side from reaching their goals, it's to make sure you reach yours. And the only way to make sure you have the highest chance of succeeding at doing that is by being open and honest about what you want out of the negotiation, and then asking what do they want, to see how you can both achieve your goals together. So diplomacy works best when it's reciprocal and honest. You give something and you get something in return. Example of reciprocal deals would be, for example, shared research programs. The EU, for its flaws, has worked on a space program. Space exploration aligns with the philosophy of action. It expands resources beyond Earth, ensuring survival, thriving, and descendants in the long run for all involved. Pooling resources for such projects benefits all participants, without violating the core principles of a philosophy of action. Reciprocal deals also build trust loops. Even if two nations aren't part of the same community, mutual reliance makes each invested in one another's success. Everyone grows together. Of course, your own nation always comes first in the hierarchy of priorities, but if you can help another nation in a way that also helps yourself, why not? And of course, there is the idea of exploitative deals. Now, what is their problem? When strong nations force a weak one to give up much in return for very little. This can work in the short to mid-term, but in the long term, such policies fail. Why? Because exploitative relationships don't create trust and reciprocity. The weaker side won't go above and beyond to sustain the relationship because it's not reciprocal. Instead, they'll try to escape it, to reassert their own national purpose, and resentment eventually will breed resistance diplomatically or militarily. That's why in the full accounting, non-reciprocal deals usually collapse. Maybe there might be rare situations where they keep existing for a long time, but history shows that they are unstable. The military as a tool of diplomacy. The military is simply an extension of diplomacy, a tool of the state. Fundamentally, it's there for national defense. Without it, you risk invasion and annihilation. But the military must also align with the three core principles of life: descendants, survival, and thriving. Interestingly, this raises questions for soldiers themselves. In my view, active military members should already have children, or at least have the opportunity to have had children. That way they can fight not just for the abstract survival of the state, but for their survival of their own descendants and the wealth of their own descendants, even at the cost of their own lives. After all, descendants go above your own personal short-term survival. Now, implementing defense. If another nation invades, their intent is almost always to violate one of your core principles, usually thriving, but sometimes survival itself. So you resist, but how? Not always by any means necessary. Sometimes surrendering in the short term ensures survival in the long run. The Khwarezmian Empire resisted the Mongols in a very brutal way by insulting their envoys, and eventually by insulting their envoys for a trade deal, and in the end the Mongols wiped them out. Rather than just surrendering to them, they kept fighting, and the more they fought, the more they got wiped out. This is a lot of the time the case with the Mongols. If a city resists, they get wiped out, but if they don't, they just pay taxes. So in such scenarios, it might be better to just pay taxes, if the enemy isn't out to exterminate you, that is. A vassal arrangement might have preserved them, therefore, for long enough to eventually recover and become its own state again. In other times, surrender isn't an option. The funny German invasion of Russia left no room for compromise. The Germans intended to eliminate all Russians, or all Slavs in their case. You must therefore fight to the last, at least the Russians should fight to the last, because the core principles and their very existence is at stake in such a fight. Surrender isn't an option, because if you surrender, you just die. Now, aggressive wars. So does this philosophy only justify defensive wars? No. Aggressive wars, wars of conquest, invasion can be justified if they serve descendants, survival and thriving in the long run. The key question is, why are you invading? What kind of victory can you realistically achieve? And how does this serve the hierarchy of values in the full accounting? Never start a war you don't think you can win. At least not an aggressive one. Defensive ones you don't start, after all. And always plan for the post-war situation. Now, some people might think that I'm only talking about wars of conquest. But there is a big problem with wars of conquest. Winning a conquest gives you new territory, but also a hostile population, generally. Then you face two choices. Integration. If the conquered people can join your national community, that's great. You can create a greater whole that can strive for survival and thriving and having descendants better. But some conquests in history worked because of this, but not all do. Look at Gaza and Israel. The Palestinians do not want to integrate into Israel, and Israel cannot force anything like that. Israel is effectively incapable and actually also unwilling to accept the Palestinians into their nation, at least as fellow Israelis, because of their beliefs. And on the other side, the Palestinians don't want to become Israeli. So you have now a scenario where you're occupying a populace that thoroughly despises you, and that will create long-term mischief and long-term resistance, and in the full accounting might cost you more than it benefits you. Furthermore, there is of course another solution: removal, deporting them, for example. Deporting a conquered population. But this creates enormous problems: resistance from the locals, backlash from the world, and perpetual unrest, at least until you've deported them all. In the modern context, this usually turns the war into a massive sunk cost fallacy. And on top of that, where are you going to deport them to? Of course, there might be other, even more disturbing solutions that some people might think of, but that just maximizes the international backlash. And the internal backlash. Most of your own people don't want to conduct such policies either. So, conquest, unless you are very lucky in conquering a people that is actually wanting, or at least ambivalent to joining your national community, is generally nowadays not an actionable goal in warfare. But there are, of course, other military objectives. Not all wars aim at conquest. Sometimes force or threat can secure concessions, trade deals, or ideological changes that make rivals less hostile in the future. These goals are valid if they serve your people in the full accounting. But success requires a theory of victory. What are your means? What are your abilities to fight? What are the enemy's ability to fight? What kind of weapons do they have? How many troops can they mobilize? What is the point of victory, and what is the failing point? Where do we say we've gotten what we wanted, we're going to stop? And where do we say this is clearly not going to succeed? We failed in our mission. We're not going to be able to break them. We're not going to be able to get our concessions. Or even if we are going to be able to get our concessions, it's going to cost us more than we're willing to invest. And here, the key here is knowing when to stop, both when you've achieved enough and when the war becomes unwinnable. And of course, the diplomacy after war. Finally, war always ends with diplomacy. So you must shape the diplomatic landscape before and during the war, ensuring that mediators exist and a peace can be negotiated on terms favorable to you, and to make sure that the diplomatic landscape after the war is friendly and willing to accept the new order of things. To conclude, with this, we have built a bare-bones framework for foreign policy under the diplomacy of action. There is much more that could be said, but that's what the comment section is for. If you think something should be added, changed, or challenged, write it down. I can't cover everything in one short video without turning it into an hour-long research paper. So like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. And as always, have a good day.